Hello, this is Barbara Tucker. This PowerPoint is on audience analysis. It is for COM 3301, the module on public presentations. In this PowerPoint, we will look at the following topics. Why is audience analysis important? What are the demographic characteristics, the psychographic characteristics, and the contextual factors of audience analysis? And to be perfectly honest, some of this should sound very familiar to you from your COM 1110 class and if you've read the textbook. So why is audience analysis important? As we've mentioned in this class before, public speaking always involves a content and relationship dimension. All communication involves content and relationship. If you don't remember much else out of this class, that's one of the things you should remember. There's always information being exchanged, but there's always statements about the relationship and how the people fit together. And communication in general is about us trying to figure out our relationship and how we fit in with other people. So public speaking really just puts this on steroids because there's a lot of content going on, but the relationship is very important. And that relationship involves audience analysis, and it also involves the old concept from Aristotle of ethos, which is the credibility of the speaker. So this relationship depends on knowing as much about your audience as possible through the analysis of demographic characteristics, which we will list, and the psychographic characteristics, which we will get into as well. When you're thinking about demographic characteristics, you have to have the right viewpoint as well as knowing what they are. You should perceive them in a positive and a negative sense. They tell you what you can appeal to in the audience, what commonalities with them you can build upon, but they also tell you what to avoid, what topics would perhaps be triggers, would not be necessary, would not be important to your overall purpose. Not all demographics are going to be important for every speech situation, and we'll get into that a little bit as we go through, but you need to decide in terms of all the 11 or so demographic characteristics that exist, which ones matter for your speech. It may only be 2 or 3. It may be more. It may be just 1. So you have to make that decision once you know more about your audience. And you definitely don't want to use the demographic characteristics for any type of stereotyping or totalizing. And stereotyping, as you know, is overgeneralizing about members of a group, and it's dangerous and we don't like it. And totalizing is really sort of the flip side of the same coin. It's acting like one characteristic of a person defines them totally. And we can do that for audiences too. So you might say, well, most of the people, this audience, they're Roman Catholic. So that means da 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 da. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only thing about them. They have other characteristics than just that they're religion. So, you know, stereotyping and totalizing are very closely tied, and they're ways of looking at the audience that are not productive. So, here are the first set of demographic characteristics. Age is the most obvious, as well as gender. We pretty much, when we look at somebody, we just sort of think, oh, older man, younger woman, little boy, middle-aged woman. We just sort of pigeonhole them automatically that way. And age obviously is important to the sense that what is important in the person's life at that time. The idea that at certain times in your life you're more involved in certain things than others, certain values and certain needs are more important. Typically we think of younger people 18 to 25 as being in college and getting an education, but we know that that's not the case now. It's even true of some of you. And I didn't go back and get my doctorate until I was 56. So that's, you know, people are learning and enrolled in college at all times. But when you're 18 or 20, you have certain things that are probably more on your mind than when you're 50 or 60. People, once they get to be 50 or 60, are very concerned about their investments and their retirement. But that's really something you should be concerned about at other stages of your life too nowadays. So the first thing about age is that it does tell you something about the audience, but you can't assume, and we're going to say that a lot of times, you can't assume everything about the audience. You need to know other things. Gender is a tricky one. Along with the idea now that didn't exist when I was younger, that there's a fluidity in gender. But we're just going to stick with the basic two. There's so many stereotypes and ideas about gender, and you really don't want to fall into those with the idea that all women love to shop and all men love football, because that's simply not the case. I think that gender probably fits mostly in how people communicate, not just what they communicate. And I will refer you back here to Deborah Tannen's work that we read earlier in Module 1 about how women and men communicate differently. Women tend to communicate with more detail and inductively, and sometimes with techniques that sort of sabotage them, and sort of too much apologizing and too much hedging and these kinds of things that don't help. But women also don't want to be fixed, and they don't like men to come with, I have all the answers and I'm not really interested in listening to you. On the other hand, men tend to be more direct and tend to be more deductive, in the sense of make your point, prove it, and then let's go on. And not wanting to have a lot of verbosity. That's one thing I've noticed in working as a supervisor, is that men are just less likely to want to write 500 words when 200 words will do. And women are more willing to do that, myself included. So think about, gender, not in stereotypical, but in how the gender tendencies in communication relate to how that affects your public speaking. Then there's race, ethnicity, and culture, which are often conflated or put together, but they're really three different things, and they're pretty controversial, especially race. Many people want to say that race is just a construct and not a real thing. Other people are saying, well, the races are based on certain parts of the country or world that you came from. If you're African American, most of your ancestors came from the continent of Africa, and these kinds of things. So, however, if you are a white person from South Africa, you are likely to call yourself an African, not a European, even though your background is really European. So, that's kind of an interesting thing. And then, of course, there are different racial groups even in Africa. So, race is definitely a tricky one. Ethnicity is sort of a subset of race. So you might have, for example, in Europe, there are different ethnicities: the French, the German, the Greeks, the Eastern Europeans, etc., Poles, Slavs, Celts, Picts, etc. Picts are the Scottish people traditionally. And then culture is going to be even more of a subset of ethnicity in many cases, although there's more to it than that. So you might have, for example, in the Hispanic community, there are lots of different cultures, even though what unites them is Spanish. And then Latino is Latin America, or Latinx, so that's slightly different than Spanish speaking. So a Brazilian would be Latinx, but would not be Hispanic, because in Brazil they speak Portuguese. Now, I bring all this up to say, don't assume that because a person speaks Spanish or has a Spanish sounding surname that, number one, they do speak Spanish, and that they're all of the same culture. Mexican culture is not Puerto Rican culture, is not Cuban culture, is not Colombian culture. So don't make those mistakes, and because it can be very, very disturbing to be that way. And think about this: you're probably American, you're not Canadian, but a person from another country would look at you and probably not know the difference. You both speak English, you both look, like Europeans, you're on the same continent, so what's the big deal? But the United States is very different from Canada, and it's a different country and different culture. Religion, oh my. Unfortunately, you can't just overlook religion. While religion is private and personal to some people, it's not to all people. Um, I like to think of religion as in two ways. One is your sort of your identification. You know, I'm one of those. I've been christened in that, and that's what I identify with, but I don't really involve myself in it. I rarely go to the services, etc. And then there's commitment. People who identify and it's really important to their worldview and who they are. So they would be heavily involved in services, going to church or the community, or they would be um, also give their money to it, or align their beliefs with the larger group. So that's different. And you also in the United States, you have to be careful because there are an, a horrible number, a huge number of denominations. And I kind of study this a little bit. And there are hundreds and thousands of denominations just in the United States, not much less the world. And, so there are lots of different kinds of Baptists, lots of different kinds of Methodists, I think different kinds of Jewish people. So you want to be careful that you know something about the group if religion comes into it. And sometimes it doesn't, but in many cases it will. And group affiliation sort of bears upon both the race and the religion and occupation and education and some of the others. But this is any group with which the audience would have strong ties. And it could be political, it could be professional, it could be sort of a hobby thing. The NRA is not so much related to people's region or their occupation, but it is very much to the idea of gun ownership. And not everyone who owns a gun belongs to the NRA, but those who are willing to pay the money to be in the NRA obviously have strong feelings about that and gun ownership and that kind of thing. Region or location, this relates to both the part of the country that you're dealing with and it relates to the kind of area that you live in. Rural, a city, urban, suburban, that kind of thing. Now we're very aware, you can look at maps of the last election and see how geographically, for example, the majority of the country voted for President Trump. Numerically, more people voted for Mrs. Clinton, but the as far as the area on the land, it's mostly red, as they say, and that's because of the electoral college, etc. But the point is that it shows the deep regional divides in our country. Occupation in the United States, most people choose their occupation based on their desires and what they're interested in, and it ties in with education. In other cultures, occupations are more tied to their families, and they might go back hundreds of years. So occupation is very important to knowing what's going to be important to the audience. So we'll move on to the next set of thank you. Okay, little glitch there. These are the next set: education, socioeconomic level, sexual orientation, and family status. And education, obviously, very important because you do not want to offend your audience. You don't want to talk down to them. You don't want to assume that because they have a certain level that they're not as smart as some other level. That's kind of elitist. And I've known people that had associate's degrees that were much more knowledgeable about certain things than would be someone with a doctorate in another field. So education says what you're exposed to. Many times people make more money just because, not because they have more education. And I'm not knocking education, obviously, it's important to me, but you can't make assumptions. You have to know more about the people than just education level. Socioeconomic would relate to the kinds of appeals. If you know the audience makes $50,000 a year, you're not going to try to sell them a vacation home in the south of France. Okay, that's a silly example, but while we don't know exactly how much people can make, you can pretty much find that out through looking at things like Glassdoor and other types of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and things like that to see what the median incomes of people in certain fields are. And in the university system, you can go online and find out how much all of us make. So that's always interesting. Sexual orientation may or may not have anything to do with your topic, but it may in some cases. In business communication, probably less. You just want to have inclusive language. Family status would be family and marital status, married, widowed, divorced, children, etc., age of children, and that will fit in some cases, and in other cases not so much. So then we come to the two that I really want to emphasize here, because you have this data about the audience, but what's the point? What do you do with it? Well, the first thing is to find the common bond. What keeps them, what brought them together? What do they have in common? And that will probably be not everything, but 2 or 3 of the characteristics. And then you want to understand how much they are different, that's what that word means, and how much they are alike. If you have an audience that's very different, heterogeneous, that's going to be harder. You're going to have to just figure out what those common bonds are and work at that. If you have a group that's very homogeneous and perhaps even like you, that's a little bit easier, but at the same time you don't want to take anything for granted. So that brings us to, now that we've looked at the demographics, let's look about the psychographic characteristics. Beliefs, attitudes, values, and needs. And I'm not going to spend as much time on these. You should have information about this already in your background. In terms of beliefs, that's what we hold to be true. Beliefs are hard but not impossible to change. Our beliefs come from experience and authority. And again, it's not what is true, it's what we hold to be true. So it forms the basis of our worldview. Beliefs are stable, means that they don't change very much. They're central, they're at the core of who they are, and of course some are going to be more central than others. My beliefs about education are much more central than my beliefs about the Tennessee football team. You know, salience means how important they are, how much I think about them, how much in my daily life this comes up. Obviously my beliefs about education are going to come up more than my beliefs about other things. And strength is how much support you have for them from experience and from authority. And knowing where the beliefs come from is important. So even with yourself, you can think about, okay, what do I believe? And then am I believing that because I've experienced it, because of evidence from other people, or from some sort of authority? You know, for example, if, you know, I don't need to experience cocaine to know that it's bad for me. I'll just go with the authorities and other people's experience. Some things I do have to experience for myself to believe. Attitude is defined as the stable, positive, or negative response to a person, idea, object, or policy. Now notice that stable, positive or negative response, and there's an object, person, idea. Because it's stable, it's not the same as a mood or emotion. Attitude has the most a direct link to what we do, to our behavior. And attitudes, though, are very complicated. They come from a lot of different places, and attitude is very well researched in psychological field and communication field. Values are what we strive for and what we consider important and desirable. These are not the same as wants. They're not necessarily the same as beliefs or attitudes. And they're also not the same as physical objects. So my husband and I have a Camaro, a 1997 Camaro, and he does not value the Camaro. He values what the Camaro represents. Okay, a house. We may value the house, but it's what does the house represent? The house may represent your desire for autonomy. It may represent your value of achievement. You've been able to afford this big house. It may be to show off. It may be to home and have you value your family and home. So the value is not a physical object. It's what the physical object represents. And the needs, of course, are important deficiencies we're motivated to fill. And you are most aware of good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which are used to describe how they operate in communication, organization, education, etc. And the theory behind Maslow at the lower level must be met and satisfied before the next level up goes into operation or is felt. And you've been exposed to this before. I used to say that you can't get out of college unless you can memorize and state Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then people started taking me seriously. So I won't say that now. Okay, so the final thing in this lecture, and I'm coming up on 22 minutes, so I want to get it done, is that contextual factors in public speaking are also important. And the first one is time. How much the time is allotted to the speech. That is your first question. That is your absolute first question, is how much time do I have? And knowing those limits, because that decides everything. It really does. And then also the time of the day the speech is given, because we know that people are different at 8 o'clock than they are at 1 o'clock than they are at 5 o'clock. So that's going to determine how much interactivity, how much heavy information. Right after lunch people are sleepy, so you might want to get them moving, things like that. Other contextual factors are: why is the audience gathered? What is the physical space like? Is it a 100-seat auditorium, but I only have 10 people, which is not good, because you know what people will do. They will sit in the back and spread out, and that's not good. It'd be better to have a 10-seat room for 10 people. The size of the audience, which relates to the previous one, and what did they expect? Why are you there in the first place? Are they there to be entertained? Are they there to be informed about a specific subject? Are they there because they have to be and really have a bad attitude about it? So all of these are important. So that pretty much brings me to